Just by way of introduction, I'm Heloïse Greeff. I'm very honored to be in a room full of economists because I am an engineer myself, so I'm very humbled by what I've seen over the last 2 days. But I patented my first AI algorithm over 10 years ago, and even then was already quite concerned about the lack of general understanding on the value of the data that was being created. And of course, over the last few years, with generative AI, that's only accelerated. And alongside that, I also built a public investment portfolio in the capital markets, which is followed by 250,000 people around the world. And so when Gavin reached out to me to ask how can we understand the value of data, but also support capital market participation and ownership, this project was the perfect combination of those two things. So we give up data every day. Sometimes it's in a direct manner, sometimes it's in an indirect manner. So it could be through the voice, the text that you're creating, the video that you're creating. Sometimes it's indirect by the way that you search on your computer, the way you navigate. And sometimes we're completely unaware of it. It might be that you are walking past a Wi-Fi sniffer that detects the way you move around the city. And big tech companies, particularly the large Big Five or now the Big Seven, have capitalized on the value of this over the last decade. And their value now actually exceeds almost $12 trillion, probably closer to 14 trillion if we now include NVIDIA. The complication of that, of course, is that young people are paying twice for this, both in their contribution as users of these platforms, but also in the fact that they are most at risk of having those entry-level jobs being threatened by the AI revolution. So the question that we have been grappling with is how can we support capital participation and structure that in a digital era? And that's where Stock for Data and Creativity has come as a solution to issue tech company stocks or shares, equity, to those who are contributing data and creativity on these platforms. So you as a user of Microsoft, Google, any of these platforms, and then building a model that allows us to potentially tilt that towards younger generation or different cohort. And we'll look a little bit at that. We have been very privileged to work with Capital Economics, who helped us to build the model. And we have Monelli here today, who is the main brain behind it, if I can say that. So if anybody has any questions about the model, please, she'll be around later to talk about that as well. So as I said, there is a strict asymmetry which exists here because the users have become the raw material for these companies to extract data, and that has in turn become a form of capital accumulation. Of course, as I said, the market capitalization for these companies exceeds the GDP of some countries, and by our estimations and other literature, it's estimated that about a third to a half of this corporate value can actually be attributed to the data that is captured by these companies. So it is a very big part of their value that they are adding in intangible assets. And compounded by that is the annual return that we see both in capital and in labor. So in the decade up to 2024, capital has had about a 25% return, whereas labor inflation adjusted has just had 1%. So how do we make sure that this flow becomes a two-way flow rather than a one-way flow? Because right now we have about 3 billion, probably more people around the world who are contributing to this big data pocket, mostly seen as a commodity right now, and held by very few or small amount of shareholders. And that wealth doesn't always compound through capital, but it's stuck as a wage very often. So yeah, as I said, we see young people who are inputting their data, and all of us actually are inputting our data. They're some of the heaviest users of search, social, e-commerce, and they're also disproportionately contributing to the training of these algorithms, which are exponentially increasing the value as we're not only using the data itself, but also nowadays creating synthetic data. So even though small individual data points might seem insignificant, the combination of those data sets or the synthetic data that we're able to create from them become exponentially more and more valuable in the system. And the latest report has shown that in the US, the younger workers saw actually 16% relative fall in employment related to AI exposed roles. And that's just because of how the generative AI is catching up with doing those entry-level tasks. So many people have grappled with this, and I'm looking forward to hearing, Matthew, your talk later as well. But what has been proposed to sort of address this issue is micropayments. So that's a single transaction cost. Right now, the sort of agreement is that we get to use the service for free, and that's the exchange that's happening right now. We don't pay for Gmail or Google as a retail user, and in return, we get to use the service for free. So that is that long terms and conditions that we all scroll past and just accept so that we can get on with signing up. Another approach is, of course, data dividends. So that's around tax and redistribution models. I think, yeah, maybe we will hear about that later. Universal basic data income. So that's just saying that they should all pay a single fee to those who use it. Of course, that's fiscally quite fragile at a global scale. And then data as a labor. So that's the wage transaction that is currently happening. Yeah, of course, none of these really address the issue of ownership, who retains the future ownership of the data, because all of them sort of capture the value of the data at a single point in time. But as algorithms keep progressing, the data becomes more and more valuable going into the future. Oop. So what we are proposing with the stocks for data and creativity is to convert that relationship with data into one of ownership, where you as the original contributor of that data gets to participate in the ownership of the productive asset going forward. So currently, data is being viewed as a commodity, something that can be extracted by the platforms and generate wealth. As I said, that creates a sort of one-dimensional flow. Under stock for data and creativity, we hope to see that owner-generating asset, which is a productive asset, flow back to the user, either through, of course, through equity, but then dividends, capital gains, and essentially governance in the companies. So the three pillars that we would see for stock for data and creativity is firstly the question around data equity. So how do we empower the consumer to become aware of exactly what they are giving up in this exchange, and acknowledging that that personal data has a value that is being extracted by the companies that should be rewarded. Secondly is technological inclusivity. So that's the corporate responsibility around, I think, the education piece, which we have heard a lot about today, making sure that people understand what they're giving up, but also how are the interface of these platforms being set up so that they are inclusive to across generations, and make sure that they are genuinely universal and that they do offer ownership and governance if you do end up getting the equity. And then finally is the economic reform. So this is the question around government regulation. Of course, data travels across borders. So this simply can't be a local UK or a single country solution. It has to be global in its implementation, which is not slightly the least ambitious. So the current model sort of, as I said, compensates data as a labor or as a wage. And that acknowledges the compensation aspect, but not necessarily the governance part. So there's no ownership going forward for people in participating what the data is used for, not only just the value that it generates. The closest, I suppose, academic view would be turning data into a capital, and that's Sadowski's view about looking at data and these data platforms as a place where these tech companies are landowners, and they essentially extract rent from the interactions that happen on their platforms. The biggest critique about that, which I've already mentioned, is Phil Yoon's view that data as a single point is not valuable by itself. So just my data might not be that valuable, but as a collective, it becomes increasingly valuable. So how do we both acknowledge the individual state value of an individual, but also the collective value of what it becomes when it's put together or held together in one large pocket? I think if we're talking about ownership, then the clearest sort of natural base for this would be Thatcher's popular capitalism, the question around ownership, property ownership as a democracy. And Stop for Data and creativity sort of goes the next step in saying that we're adding the egalitarian framework where pre-distributed productive assets can be used, and acknowledging that if that has to happen at a global scale, then technology offers the opportunity for us to do that. So as I mentioned, we worked with capital economics to build a model to see if we can understand some of the intended and unintended consequences of what a policy like this would look like. Of course, if you are suddenly offering people shares for, being on a platform, would that have an unintended consequence of encouraging young people to be more active on platforms, which is not what we would want to do. We just want to capture the existing sort of behavior. We selected 10 companies: Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Alibaba, ByteDance, Duolingo, OpenAI, and Revolut, to try and give us a good spread across different categories, but also across different regions. For the sensitivity analysis, we looked at 21 different countries, and projected that out to 2050 to make sure that we really understand both the value that the individual users would derive, but also, of course, the big question around share dilution and the impact of on the companies themselves. So as a sequential sort of thought process to go through the simulator, the first step and the most important one is probably the question around how do we value this data? A lot of these companies, of course, would have their own internal workings or algorithms of how they value it, because they derive either through marketing or alternative product value through it. But how do we choose something that is also fair to the contributors? And the three options we considered was valuing it as a proportion of the revenue share of the company, valuing it as a proportion of the market cap, and then also a fixed data income. Then once we have identified the value of the data, what proportion of that should be distributed every year? I mean, there's a feasible amount that you could distribute without necessarily, sinking the company, which is also not what we want to do. And then the allocation split. So if we have this pocket of money that we identify as the value of the data, do we just distribute that all in one lump sum? Or can we have a part of it which is weighted towards user type? And then how do we define the value of those recipients, either through the use, how intensely they use the platform, age category, which is one that we were particularly interested in, what they're contributing, their socioeconomics, because of course, as a higher income user, I might spend less time on those platforms, but to the company, my spending power is higher. So it's not necessarily that more data is more valuable in that correlation. And then finally, looking at the outcomes. So the per recipient net present value, the impact on the dilution of the company, and then more broadly, the Gini coefficient change that we saw across different countries. So in terms of understanding the revenue and the user numbers, as I've already alluded to, having more users doesn't necessarily mean that the company has larger revenues. It also depends, because we had such a cross-cutting across different categories, it also depends on the platform, what service they offer, whether it's retail clients or whether it's corporate clients. So a good example is Amazon, which clearly has a much lower user base, but the revenue is much larger just purely because of the services that they offer, both in terms of the cloud services for their corporate clients, but also the logistics arm of that. And then just reviewing some of the results that Capital Economics came up with for the valuation of the data. So quickly, it became clear that the fixed income approach, so that would be saying that all tech companies have to pay the same amount to all of their users, and a sort of universal approach was quite unviable for those companies with higher user counts, because as we just saw, the user count doesn't always necessarily correlate directly to a higher revenue. So you can't have somebody like Duolingo paying out more than 200% of their value, because it's simply not possible. Oh. The next one was around, do we do it as a percentage of the revenue valuation? Again, this hit companies with revenues relative to their market cap much more than those who had bigger revenues. So clearly not a viable option from the company perspective. And then finally, if we choose it as a percentage of the market cap, it came across to be the most fair, effective, and viable way for redistributing what is owed for the data across all of the different companies. The base case was selected as 2%, and I'll go through why that seemed like a viable option. But first, to look at the case for Meta, if we look at the 10-year portfolio value, so if an amount is paid out to a user every year for 10 years, and they can't dispose of that, so that you have to hold your stocks that is being issued to you, the future value of that as the percentage of the impact of the minimum wage in the US for Meta users, considering that across the percentage of the data that is being allocated, or the percentage of the market cap that is being allocated, clearly the more you distribute, the more people would receive. But there is also only an incremental benefit from the user's perspective. So trying to find that balance between how much dilution is the company willing to accept versus what amount actually gets paid out that would have an impact for the users. Because of course, if it's too small, it may not be able to have an impact. And so in terms of the impact on the users, there is, as I said before, there is a difference between the revenue of the company and how much is being paid out, which isn't related to the amount of users. So we see a large disparity across the portfolio value. And what that means is, for example, users of Amazon tend to have larger disposable income because they're buying services on there. And they would get a substantially larger gain than those users of other platforms. So making sure that there's also equality across the different platforms, and you're not actually exaggerating inequality further through the policy. The big question is obviously, why would companies do this? Why would they agree to this? Why would they dilute their shares? Early talks with Meta and their approach to distributed governance shows that they're quite willing to at least engage in the conversation, trying to get ahead of the regulation and acknowledging that there is some shared value that is being created and that there is some responsibility to give that back to users. Finding that sweet spot of how much dilution is feasible and how much of example in the case of Meta, if we look at existing Meta shareholders across a 10-year time horizon, if there's no policy, that would grow, the percentage change would be 234% over a 10-year period. Of course, if some of that stock is being distributed out every year, that would be less for the existing shareholders. And 2% seemed like a feasible midway, which gives some benefit back, of course, acknowledges the dilution in a way that is fair to both the users who contribute as well as the existing shareholders. But that is by no means the answer to this very hairy problem. As I said, we then built the option of potentially looking at distributing that value weighted differently depending on the recipients. So the idea was, if you have this pocket of money that is being distributed, if 80% or some proportion of it is paid out as a lump sum, equal weighted to all users, and a small amount is held aside, which could then be distributed at different ratios depending on the user's, in this case, age. So would you give 1.6x to your younger group because they're paying more upfront for the data over the long term? And the impact of that was quite stark in terms of seeing the boost of income by age group. Of course, naturally, because they're earning less, the impact would be bigger purely because the base is smaller. But shifting that scale between how much of it is weighted towards the younger generation is not that impactful for the older generation. And so that sort of supports quite closely that this is an option where age-related top-ups can exacerbate the impact. And then finally, as I said, there is some potential for inequality that happens across the platforms as well. So, for example, users of Amazon tend to be older users. So the benefit or the closing of that gap is slightly less depending on the platform, depending on the demographics of the age of the users on that. And so it opens the debate around whether that weighting in age group should be standardized across tech platforms or whether they are individualized for different companies, different sectors, and even different geographics. But overall, it's striking that universality alone can't help to close this income gap, and that the younger cohorts are much more sort of supported by this intergenerational income gap, which has a much bigger impact for them through this approach. And so, as I said, the model is hopefully an early discussion of what this could look like as an alternative to tax or nationalization for addressing what the value that data is generating. And lot of these levers are, I showed the base case today, but of course, they are very much for us to still debate and discuss and understand, particularly in terms of our discussions with the companies, how much share is being released, what percentage of dilution is acceptable, and whether it is fair to have the age weighting, and how much retroactive recognition should be given, and how far do we go back? Because a lot of this value has already been captured. And for this, we're just doing it going forward. So yeah, the fairness around that. So yeah, I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. I don't know if there's any questions or comments or.
Thank you. Very interesting model. I just wanted to ask two things. One, you said you've had some engagement with Meta. I don't know about any other companies. Why do you think they even wanted to discuss this model rather than just say absolutely no way? And obviously, if you had to do this on a global level, it would become extremely, extremely difficult. Is there a feasible way of trying a version of it in one country or region to show proof of concept?
Yeah, that's a great question. On why they would even engage with it, I think it's simply a fact that Meta in particular runs on a sort of distributed governance model. They do acknowledge that they have to be part of what is potentially coming. So if there is going to be regulation around this, I think they would much rather volunteer in shaping it than sort of, being hit with it later. So at least that was the sense from those early conversations. Rolling it out on a global scale, yeah, that is the challenge. Of course, it's difficult to do it without acknowledging that data moves across borders every day, without hesitation. I think, except for China, not many other countries have thought about the value of this in going into the future. And so that is what we're hoping to be the next step from the model, is to build a simulator and then potentially around having a pilot in a single country, acknowledging also that the education aspect of it and the way we talk about money even varies by culture, by country, by language. And the ownership aspect really means that we have to ensure that it's not that people simply get given these shares and immediately dispose of them. There would be some lock-in period because we want that ownership and governance aspect to be a core part of it.
About the durability of those things. I think 95% of the companies that you put up there were American transnationals or Chinese transnationals. I think Revolut popped in as well,
Yeah.
Duolingo. So in terms of durability, I think we already have a digital services in quite a few, particularly European countries. I think it's 2% in the UK. I think Turkey are well ahead on 7.5%, but I'm not sure how in support of that either the US or China would be. So what about an intermediate step of the UK government? I'm looking here at Gavin in terms of ring-fencing inheritance tax proceeds. But what about actually using some of the digital services tax proceeds for the UK government to go out in the market and buy these shares on the open market and then distribute them to, it could be tilted to the lost boys or lost girls, or it could be across the whole population. What about that as a solution? Second question, to be greedy, is asking about what's been your experience about other potential AI tools that disadvantaged people could be skilled up in using, as well as a potential tech disruptors of the future. So we have a third leg, not just American or Chinese state capitalism or crony capitalism companies, but an alternative model. What do you think about that?
I'm going to start with your second question, and maybe, Gavin, I don't know if you want to have a go at the first question. I think, so I previously worked in healthcare data specifically, but one of the largest disruptors in AI I think we'll see is in education through personalized curriculums. And we're already seeing that coming through. Would that make it all the way to disadvantaged communities? I hope so. I mean, I'm from South Africa, and having seen how technology allows the leapfrog of certain communities, I hope we see that in Britain as well and across the world. And I think one of the things with AI is, unlike the Industrial Revolution, it doesn't require large capital inputs in order for people to participate. You just really need a smartphone to get access. And so that makes it, for me, and it's really exciting in terms of seeing the level playing field.
I'd say it's an intriguing idea to actually try and converge the two things we've been talking about this morning. But I think actually that there are some challenges with doing that. When you talk about, doing things for young people from very disadvantaged backgrounds, we do think that their interests first, and that we wouldn't necessarily be concentrating their assets in just tech companies from that point of view. So I think we do need something a bit broader than that. We talked about, incentivized learning, and that, yes, something to go on with that. The other thing is that really, I do appreciate that it's going to be a challenge to get this going globally. And actually, it's a combination of plus factors and minus factors. I mean, before I really committed just to charity, I was running the Share Centre, which is a retail investment business. And I understand individual share ownership quite thoroughly. I've seen the whole process of, for example, companies which actually do have employee and customer share ownership structures. And the degree of participation you get with that is really quite exciting. And you may think that this is just a negative approach in terms of diluting companies, but we're talking about the potential of having people right across the world helping to steer the way that technology develops. We all read our newspapers every day. We can see the challenge that the tech companies have in terms of, are they actually putting too much on their social media pages, or in the right way or the wrong way, or whatever it is. At the moment, it's just governments which have to make all the calls on that. But let's say that people actually were the people who actually were contributing and steering that, and doing it in a positive way. In fact, the more they became excited about their ownership of Meta shares, the more they use Meta, and likewise with Amazon and so on. So I would say actually there is a dual process here. Some of it is positive. It is. We do need the regulators behind this. I went to have a chat with Sir Hector Sands some time ago, and I said, "Well, what chance is there of the regulators actually getting behind this?" He said, "Well, actually, we need to see a little bit of momentum going first before we can get involved with that sort of stuff." But I think there's a lot of threats on tech companies from regulation. And that is on a global scale, not just on a national scale. It's in all sorts of countries. We see it in Australia, we see it in America, we see it here. And actually, to have the individual participation is quite important. So I think, I remember discussing this with David Good up in Cambridge, who's the chap who's involved with our project before Gareth Austin. And Gareth's here somewhere, nowhere at the back there. But it was David who talked about, the whole process of how far a project is through. And we talked about incentivized learning. He said, well, on this grade of, up to 1 to 10, it's about sort of 6 or 7. Stop for data and creativity. It's about step 1 or 2. It's got a long way to go, but we're going to get there.
Thanks. That's a really interesting presentation and idea. I'm intrigued, but I stumble over understanding how we value the data and how we answer the question of value to whom. and how market structure affects this. So I can think of, I have a company and I've got lots of proprietary data that I've collected from other people, and it's exclusive to my use. That's valuable to me. Under that market structure, I have the monopoly. If other AI firms also have the same data, then I no longer have the same competitive edge. And so that can radically reduce value. So to that question of how are we actually valuing under what market conditions, seems to be really central.
Yep. Yeah, and I think we had a go at it through the 3 different approaches, mostly related to the existing value of the company, which we acknowledge is sort of very limited in its approach. And a lot of what we attributed to the value or the proportion of that being related to the data is again what we could get from literature. But yeah, it's central to the project. I agree.
So value, so if we bring value to the company under the current market structure, I think if we're trying to attribute a particular share of the company's total market cap with data, there'd be a whole load of information. I find it very difficult to figure out how we get access to it. I don't even think the data companies themselves really understand what share of their value actually comes from the data that they possess. It'd be very, very difficult for a regulator to try and identify that as well.
Yep.
I think one of the key aspects about this is that, we need to understand. One of the key aspects is we need to understand that both data and creativity is dissolved very quickly in technology companies. It is very, of course, when you first put in your data, you have to answer the form which says, you prepared with this data to you marketing purposes, and then you think twice about that. Usually it just goes straight on through. But actually, because it is dissolved so quickly, we actually have to come up with generic solutions for this, which are weighed up on a reasonable basis across the board, rather than try and be algorithmic in our. It's very difficult to track through on an algorithmic basis. I think everybody would understand. So actually, we are going to be looking at dissolved solutions on this, and that's why capital economics have been working with the, what is a reasonable percentage to actually apply this, and probably on a growing year by year. Sorry,
No, I think, and to that point, even the acceleration of what value we're extracting from it, and the use of now synthetic data, which it then compounds the data that is already part of the core data. In essence, I think we agree that we've missed the point where we could have that direct sort of, this came in and this is attributed to that. I think we are past that point. It's now a conversation about how do we have a solution that is fair towards both the contributors and not destroying the market as well.
Yes, I know this question. This is extraordinary. The traditional model of business capitalism, I buy a product from him. It's a nice product. He's the most competitive supplier. Thank you very much. He gets a limited amount of data from me, but that's his freebie. I don't care. He's providing me a service. This is really a whole different philosophy that he owes me because he's got a bit of data from me. Now, in this room, I don't know how many people were familiar with this new concept before they walked in here, not me. And I wonder how many people out there, the billions of users who are chucking in data, thinking that company now owes me. What we talk about with the tech companies is quite rightly safeguarding, cyber attacks and stuff like that, which is right and fair. This seems to me, this is really, really, really fascinating. Is it widely perceived out there that there's a debt of payment for data owed to us by the tech companies?
You know what I mean? Is it
Yeah.
just those cutting edge economists that are sort of realizing that this is a new thing?
I mean, I'm an engineer, so from that perspective, I understood the value of it, but I think there isn't an understanding of how much we're giving up. And I think, Matthew, maybe to your point, one of the solutions I have seen is sort of related to the point in the sharing economy and how those users transfer their value between different platforms. So if I have a 5-star on Uber, do I get a 5-star if I become a TaskRabbit user? So how does that loyalty and responsibility sort of move with the user? The sort of closest thing to that is the digital twins approach, where you then sort of absorb and own your entire digital footprint, which is, of course, yeah, again, I think we're past that point. We've already given up too much in order to put that back into the bottle.
But I think what's also relevant to this, I mean, when somebody writes a book, like this excellent book called Challenging Inequalities by Paul Johnson, which is really good, not Paul Barlow, he's got the copyright on that. Okay, so when I extract his quotes and put them in my commentating in Share Radio, you ought to charge for something like that, because it's not copyright. I think that's what law says. You know, if you design a bit of invention, you have a patent, and you actually, you know, that's your patent, and you know, the company which exploits it actually owes you something for that. Now, you know, when we put our data and our creativity into this tech stuff, you know, we're doing the same thing. You know, so you know, the actual example of you know, it's already there in copyright law, which is 300 years old. It's already there in patent law. So,
But I presume you signed it away in that scrolling thing that we never read, and we all went down and we clicked the button at the end, that we waived our copyright on all of these.